Hi, my name is Dr. Jason Farman. I am a professor at the University of Maryland, and I'm also the Associate Dean of the graduate school here. And today I'm going to be talking about the rise of technological surfaces and the ways that the affordances of technology have receded behind these surfaces, limiting our interactions with the inner workings of our technologies and the implications of this. So part one of my talk is looking at how technology got a surface. And a fantastic example of this is the futuristic imaginings of technologies. One place that we can see this vividly is in the Star Wars franchise, where the design of the Empire and their uniforms and all of the technologies related to the Empire is smooth and glossy. It's hermetically sealed, and this stands in contrast to the Rebel Alliance, which is piecemeal, it's open, it's gritty, it's got all of its technological guts showing. This was talked about by Aliquer Roseanne Stone in her article, Split Subjects, Not Atoms, where she writes, in Star Wars, the first street tech film, it was the bad guys who had the shiny, polished equipment and the good guys who had the dirty, leaking stuff, the stuff with the potential for contamination and infection. And we can see this sense of the technological surface in the design of Apple's technologies. Here's Johnny Ives' designs for Apple, where we can see the seamless design in much of our own technologies and the smooth surfaces that are really emblematic of all of the digital technologies we interact with. So my question is, how did we get here? And what are the implications? How did we arrive at a place where the imaginings of design and technology are really fundamentally connected with a glossy surface that removes us from a sense of the inner workings of these technologies? And this talk traces this back to the 1920s, with automobile design having the aim of hiding the inner workings behind the gloss of the new, and the design of the annual model change to stimulate purchasing, and the creation of smooth glossy surfaces as a way to stimulate purchasing rather than updating the technologies and the inner workings, and letting people have a real direct connection with how these technologies function. This leads to part two of my talk, which is about disappearing affordances. When someone looked at technology from the early 1920s or the early 1900s in general, from vacuum cleaners to automobiles, from tractors to clothes irons, they could easily identify what the technology was capable of, what we would call the tool's affordances. So users could see the affordances visibly on the surface of the technology itself. So if you look at something like the cotton gin from the 1790s, you see all of the inner workings of this machine and you understand clearly how it functions. And this is, in the United States, a very racialized technology, because it created an ease of use for dealing with cotton, which at the time the inventor hoped that this would reduce the need for slave labor in the United States, but because of the technology here, it actually extended slavery within the U.S. Because the rise of expectations of what people could accomplish led to the increase of slavery here. So somebody could look at the cotton gin and immediately know what it was capable of, and then they would put it to use. In an interesting parallel, washing machines for the household in the 1890s, you would look at it and understand how it functioned and be able to take it up and begin working with it, because the affordances of the technologies were visible right in the machine itself. In the 1930s, a tank heater like the Cleaver Brooks machine here have all of its guts showing. All of the workings of the machine are right on the surface itself. In 1941, industrial designer Brooks Stevens redesigns the tank heater and creates a very smooth streamlined design that hides the inner workings of the technology behind this surface. So this points to the notion of affordances and the movement of affordances from the exterior to the interior. So the affordances are the perceived and actual properties of the thing, as Donald Norman writes in The Design of Everyday Things, that determine just how the thing could possibly be used. Jenny Davis writes about affordances in her book, How Artifacts Afford. She says, affordances mediate between a technology's features and its outcomes. Affordances are how objects shape action for socially situated subjects. So in the early 20th century, product form was generally determined by engineers and draftsmen on the basis of technical specifications. So the surface of a technology was dependent on the interior of it, the mechanics of it, the machinery, the engineering. So there was a direct relationship between the engineering of a machine and the way it looked. General Motors in the 1920s hired Harley Earl to be the head of design, and Harley Earl's goal was to detach those things. He wanted to decouple form and function. So he went to extremes to show the engineering folks at General Motors that things could be done with the surfaces of their cars that had absolutely nothing to do with the inner engineering mechanics of the car. The goal was to decouple these things and make them not reliant on them, which really transformed the relationship between form and function in the early 20th century. And here we see a factory in the early 20th century that was very much a highly inflexible space where it's dependent on the standardization of components that have a very limited range of products that could be sold and produced cheaply based on what the factory was capable of. In contrast to this, in the early 1920s and after, you have a move from a craftsman style factory to an assembly line, to Ford's use of the assembly line to create very cheap products and make it a more flexible thing in nature where you can adapt the assembly line to the item. And assembly line work produces mass goods that are cheaper alongside rising wages at the time, so more people to buy these things, and the move to urban centers, the rise of electrification, the overall quality of life rising alongside the mass production of goods. You have the rise of plastics that allow for the shaping of surfaces of technologies to, again, be decoupled from the engineering and mechanics of it. So the rise in mass manufacturing of goods and the ability to purchase these things creates a very different market for the production of items and how they can look. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, with the rise of the Great Depression, you have automobile companies facing the need to generate purchasing because there is a steep decline in purchasing of cars at the time. Ford at the time approaches his design of the Model T, which is pictured here, as the end of the line here. There is no need to update the Ford Model T. It is everything that Henry Ford wants it to be, and he believes that he does not need to accommodate a desire for the new. Instead, he wants to have people simply purchase the good that he's given them. And General Motors at the time realizes that this is an entry point for them to be able to go in and compete with Ford for the market share of the automobile industry. General Motors' engine was in no way comparable to Ford's. It was of a lesser quality, and they could not compete with his engineering. What they could compete with was the psychology around a desire for newness. So they produced cars that were every year slightly different in more colors and more shapes, with more chrome and glossy surfaces. And you would see these cars driving down the street in comparison to the Model T, which had not changed in years and years and would not change. compared to the new GM car, the new Chevrolet, or the new Chrysler, or the new Cadillac would drive down the street and it would look new. And the newness stimulated purchasing based on the exterior of the car, not necessarily the inner workings of the car, but the exterior glossy surface that was presented. So alongside the rise of the annual model change, you have the rise of a new industry called industrial design, a new field of work. In the late 1920s, offices of industrial designers are opened all across the country by Raymond Loewy, Norman Bell Geddes, Henry Dreyfuss, Walter Darwin Teague, among others. And Raymond Loewy, as one of the pinnacle industrial designers of the time, on his business card had written, "Between two products equal in price, function, and quality, the better looking will outsell the other." So this leads to the third part of this talk, which is how this intersects with gender and the rise of industrial design in post-World War II society, and the rise of the nuclear family and the housewife as the primary purchaser of goods at the time. Christine Frederick wrote a book in 1929 that addresses what she called Mrs. Consumer. And Mrs. Consumer, she writes, is happiest when she consumed goods at the same approximate rate of change and improvement that science and art and machinery can make possible. So in 1925, similarly, Carl Nather writes that women are the buyers-in-chief for the household, and he wrote that in Advertising to Women. And this intersects with this idea of planned obsolescence that Christine Frederick introduces and is later taken up by Brooks Stevens, an industrial designer out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Brooks Stevens coins this term, planned obsolescence, in a brochure where he describes it as the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. So within the household of the 1940s, where you have a move away from communal work and multi-generational households to a single housewife running a household, these new products with these glossy surfaces were sold to housewives as a way to help make this new level of work more manageable. So in House and Garden magazine in 1947, they wrote that these gleaming silent servants, such as washing machines, dishwashers, irons, that were all streamlined and presented as very user-friendly, would free the housewife from all of this work. And Brooks Stevens similarly argued that the new gadgets would alleviate the drudgery of domestic work. Janice Williams Rutherford has written that historians of domestic labor have demonstrated such gizmos did little to lessen the total amount of work required to maintain a mid-century household. So Walter Darwin Teague similarly writes in opposition to this new emerging idea that you want people to desire something new that's going to potentially make their life a little bit better, simply around the idea of newness. He wrote that planned obsolescence, he wrote against it, writing that the function of design, simply put, is to realize the true character of the thing designed and to reveal the values that have been built into it. If it is used for camouflage, it's being prostituted. So the goal of industrial design in post-World War II society is to make objects appear new, make them easy to use. And part of that process is to decouple the affordance from the surface. Action is instead represented through things like push buttons and easy-to-use interfaces. Here you can see what is called the push-button kitchen. And Rachel Plotnick has written about this in her book, Power Button, fascinating exploration of the rise of push-button societies. And the final section of this talk focuses on how the larger implications of this, which are a shift in our embodied connection to technology. So as this journey has continued from the 1920s to now, the technological guts have receded inwards. The functioning of how these things work takes place on a surface that detaches us from the inner workings of these technologies. Again, referring to Aliquot Roseanne Stone's article, the newly constructed shroud, described as streamlined, futuristic, and decorative, not only conceals the operation of the device, which has been hitherto implicit in its specularity, thus producing the interiorized space of desire, but also redirects the gaze to a featureless, shiny screen upon which is projected the new meaning and purpose of technological prosthetics in an age in which the physicality of agency is irrelevant. Stone goes on to write, and thus, on one hand, the whole arena of machinic surfaces becomes organized in relation to the gaze, while on the other, the chthonic interior space of technology is heightened in its mystery and allure. This polished exterior carapace, with its suggestion of brutality, calls into being the soft, vulnerable organs of the technological body. The gendering of such a dual phantasmatic is obvious, although the precise quality of that gendering is not. So from push buttons to touch screens, our agency has been removed from the interior workings and is instead replaced with technological surfaces. So affordances are still presented to us all the time, every day. We're constantly approached with affordances, how things function, what they do, what they're capable of. But those affordances have become simulacra. So an app icon that responds to a push is nodding back to an archetype of previous push button interfaces. And these earlier push buttons are nodding back to earlier technological eras that pointed us to the ease of power transfer in those particular technological ages. So those were references of previous eras, and what we are left with instead are simulacra. So what are the larger outcomes of this removal? Ultimately, I argue that, building on Lisa Park's terms, that we're losing a sense of technological and infrastructural literacy. One of the sites of this, in a fascinating kind of way, is the tractor. Here is Brooks Stevens, again, his redesign of a tractor into a more streamlined look. And tractors have become actually a site of infrastructural literacy in the United States, where we can see that there is a removal of agency over the inner workings of these things. John Deere, as a tractor company, has not allowed farmers and tractor owners to go into the inner workings of the machines and fix them because they are hidden behind a surface of proprietary software. And John Deere has historically not allowed tractor owners and farmers to go in and fix things. Instead, they have to ship them off to John Deere centers or take them to authorized repair locations in order to get them fixed. And the owners want to be able to go in and tinker with them themselves. So here in the United States, farmers are at the forefront of a right to repair movement that says we need to not be held at arm's length behind these surfaces, these proprietary surfaces. We want to be able to get into the inner guts of the machine and fix it ourselves. So what we see is this movement toward a desire to, again, connect with the inner workings of these machines in an embodied way. So the larger consequences of this have implications on policy, but also things on, such as our purchasing habits and our own embodied connection to these technologies. So as we think about our own infrastructural and technological literacy, often we are really held at arm's length, and we only are allowed to connect with the surfaces of machines rather than really truly understand the inner workings of them. And the affordances we're presented with on a daily basis are instead these simulacra of how things actually function. And we see a move away from that with things like the right to repair movement, where people do want to get back to the inner workings of these machines and move past the representations to actually know how things function, to move away from the glossy surfaces toward the guts of the machine, and really connect with it in a more direct, embodied way. Thanks for taking the time to listen to my talk today. I very much appreciate it.